What does it mean to you when your doctor says you have inherited the genes for a certain disease? If you're like me, you probably assume the worst and you think the life ahead is doomed. Yes, this is how I thought at one point of time when my doctor told me that I have the genes for tuberculosis. Despite me being trained in cytogenetics, this is the way the human mind works because of our existing perception. We talked about perception in a recent video, and we also ended on a note that we need to be aware of our perceptions that leads to our less than ideal outcomes in our life. So in other words, some of our existing perceptions which we sort of inherited. When I say sort of inherited, these perceptions are not in our genes, surely, but we have chosen to incorporate these perceptions into our psychological makeup. So we judge by default using these existing perceptions that we model from or we copy from the adults or others that we respect and that we grow up around, usually our parents or other elders who are our primary caretakers and also role models in our lives. So we inherit these perceptions. So we're going to examine how sometimes these perceptions that have formed a part of our psychological makeup can break us, and why it's so important to examine our existing perceptions and break it down and reconstruct or replace it with a perception that is empowering. So today we're going to discuss this using the example of genetically inherited diseases. Okay, in 2016 I had a condition that led to symptoms like breathlessness, pleural effusion, and incessant irritating dry cough. Some of it being, these are some of the symptoms. And apart from this, I also started experiencing water retention starting from my lower limbs, specifically my ankle, and then slowly progressing upwards. These were the symptoms that I had. So when I sought medical treatment, doctors immediately used these symptoms to diagnose me with a condition that at that moment they were most familiar with. They extracted tissue samples from around my lungs, and when they tested these tissues in the lab, there was no sign of the TB causing bacteria. Yeah? TB is a bacterial infection. I discussed with my doctors. I said, this maybe it's not TB. Okay, it's fine if it's confirmed to be TB, but what if it's not, because you did not find the bacteria? And they said, okay, we will do a genetic test to see whether you have the gene for TB. So what she actually meant was she would do a genetic test to see if I have the gene that makes me vulnerable to tuberculosis. And I agreed. There is the moment when I failed to think clearly. I somewhere in my mind, due to my compromised health state, I accepted that if I am found to have the gene for TB, then it is highly likely that I have TB now. Do you see the mistake that I made? Yes, the gene for TB does not mean that I actually have TB. It only means that I have the gene that makes me more vulnerable to a tuberculosis infection if I am exposed to the bacteria. What I'm trying to communicate here is about how our perception can sometimes dig our grave. So I had a perception that if you have a gene for a disease, you will definitely have the disease, or you definitely have that disease. Okay, so I've heard this same kind of thinking so many times amongst my friends and family, right? If you have the gene for diabetes, you will develop diabetes at the time when you're around 40 or 50. Problem with the perception, yeah? A perception that needs to change. Who is to tell you that you have the gene for diabetes? You probably get diabetes because your mother had diabetes because she had certain type of food, large amounts of certain type of food, and she never exercised. You just modeled her, so you develop diabetes too at around the same age, or a little earlier even than your mother, or a little later, right? So what I'm trying to say is, while it is true there are genes that cause certain diseases, yeah, but when doctors say you have the gene for a condition or a disease, it is not necessarily true that this gene is a cause for a disease. This could just be a gene that is linked to a certain disease, right? Let's look at TB, for example. Having this gene, which is actually a gene that is mutated, and this gene is responsible for encoding a certain type of enzyme. Enzyme is a type of protein in your body, and because the gene that encodes this enzyme is mutated, your body does not produce this enzyme, and therefore you are vulnerable to TB infections if you are exposed environmentally to the bacteria Mycobacterium tuberculosis. That's all. It doesn't definitively mean that you have TB. So in the same way, if you have a gene for example, breast cancer, this doesn't mean that you will definitely develop breast cancer. This only means that you have the gene that predisposes you to breast cancer. You have a gene that is linked to breast cancer, and this gene does not express itself out of its own will. It is the environment that you subject yourself to in terms of food and in terms of your lifestyle, the stress that you subject yourself to, in terms of the internal environment that you create for your cells and tissues by virtue of what you eat, what you drink, your lifestyle, what you think, what you predominantly feel, yeah, the emotions. For example, if you're a person who's always living in fear of a health challenge, then you're subjecting yourself to stress and creating an internal environment that will lead to the manifestation of such a disease. So it's the environment, it's not your gene. And this is an example of how our perception can cause a problem for us. Of course, we talked about medical problem today because that comes very close to my heart due to my own experience recently, but this is also true in many other situations across all the 8 pillars of key results areas in our lives. Yeah, our perception needs to be examined, needs to be preserved if it serves us, if it's empowering us. But if it is found to be working against us, if a particular perception that we have is found to be to our detriment, we have to break it down, reconstruct a new perception that serves us in our journey towards reinventing ourselves. I hope this video was useful. If you like this video, remember there will be a new video every week around topics that serve to empower you and help you reinvent yourself to live your best life yet. Thank you for watching, and bye-bye.